Thank you, Matt. Hello, everyone. Give us a wave so I can see that there's people out there. Big part of being a storyteller is having this interaction with the crowd and the people that you work with. So doing it on Zoom's always a little bit funny because you don't get that response. So if anybody wants to pull a funny face at me or wave their hands, then that's it's welcomed from me to know that you're there and listening and enjoying the story. Matt said he wouldn't waffle, so I will try not to waffle too. But if you do bring a storyteller onto a webinar, there's a good chance that they've got a lot to say. But I'm going to do my best to try and stay on track. I really want to talk to you tonight about storytelling and using storytelling in your forest school setting. My background, I'm an outdoor educator really at my roots, and forest school leader, and then became a forest school trainer. And it was in that transition kind of between regular outdoor education and forest school, I started to really see the power of stories and the power of storytelling. And storytelling has now been a part of my forest school practice for probably about 10 years. Um, During the lockdown, I started up a project called We Be Kids, where some of you may recognize my face from, where me and my partner, Annie, we were just sat at home, probably like a lot of you, wondering what we could do to help. And I said, you know what? The world needs more stories now, and it needs more stories about nature. So I started recording stories and putting stories out there on the internet for people to listen to, people to enjoy, and to really inspire people out into nature and give them a reason and a purpose to go out. So for the webinar today, we're going to look at a few different things, and I'm going to use story throughout the hour or so to guide us along this journey. We're just going to start by talking about the difference between a narrator and a storyteller. And I'm going to look a little bit at the history of storytelling and how storytelling affects cultures. And we're going to tie that into forest school by looking at the history of childhood and play as well. And then I'm going to look at the kind of stories that we might want to tell at forest school. And I'm going to tell you a few stories. We're going to look at story as a cultural guide, story as a facilitator, and story as a playmate as well. And then, if you've not all disappeared and gone to bed, we'll do some storytelling tips and tricks at the end as well. But hopefully, as we go through, we'll pick up some of the storytelling tips and tricks as well. Does that sound all right with everyone? Give me a thumbs up if that's all. Yes, good, 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 good. Okay, so on the sections where I'm going to tell you some stories, I'm going to share some slides, and there is a QR code on that story. If you want to hear the story again, you can just scan that QR code and you'll find it on We Be Kids. If we get towards the end and we're running out of time, then you can just scan the QR codes at your leisure and listen to the stories. We'll just talk about them. So let me just share my screen and bring my slides up. This is the first test, isn't it? Did we manage that? That was very, very smooth, wasn't it? Okay. So the first little thing I want to talk to you about is the difference between a storyteller and a narrator. And when I do a lot of the storytelling training, a lot of the main question that people come to me asking is, they say, Danny, how do we remember the stories? How do we do it? We're afraid of standing there and it just all disappearing from our minds. And when we do storytellers tips and tricks later, there'll be a few things in there to help. But the most important thing to grasp when it comes to remembering the story is understanding the difference between a storyteller and a narrator. And the best way to explain that is that a narrator tells other people's stories. A storyteller brings their own story into the world. And the only way that the storyteller can bring their own story into the world is by having a deep understanding about what it is that they want to tell the world. What are the key things in our life that has made our story that we feel the world needs to hear? So it's a little bit of internal searching. And we're not going to do that tonight because we just don't have time. But whenever we do the training that I do, I tend to give people 2 questions to consider. One of the questions is, think about the 3 best decisions you ever made. The other question is, think about the 3 worst decisions that you ever made. And by considering those 2 questions and those 6 moments, it will make you have a little bit of introspection and start to think about, who am I? What is my story? And how do I put that story out there into the world? And the difference between the narrator and the storyteller is, when we understand the storyteller's heart, we will seek and we will search or even write the stories that we want to put into the world, rather than just tell other people's stories. Now, there's no hierarchy here between narrator and storyteller. It's totally fine to be a narrator as well. But if you're interested in being a storyteller, I would really encourage you to engage in a little bit of this work, which I call the storyteller's heart work. But I've got a little bit of a story that could help us a little bit with this and kind of get us on the way. And this story is called The Little Songbird. And I'm going to tell it for you. And this story, The Little Songbird, I first saw it in a book form, and it was written, or is written, by a man, an author and an illustrator called Vern Kowski. He's from the US. And it goes like this. So I'm sure that wherever you live, wherever you're sat right now, not too far from your house, there is a stream. And if you were to go out and you were to find the nearest stream and follow that stream, eventually it would run into a river. And if you followed that winding river as it got wider and wider, at some point you would come to a great big sandy bank. And on that sandy bank, there is a small wooden boat with 2 oars. And if you were to jump into that boat and use one of the oars to push you into the water, and you would begin to paddle and paddle, the river would wash you downstream until it spat you out into the ocean. And then in the ocean, you'd get carried by the Gulf Stream and the northern currents, and you'd go further and further and further north. And eventually, you would arrive at an island. And this island is surrounded by beautiful, clear blue water. And the blue water meets golden sands. And the golden sands meet small shrubs. And the shrubs become great big trees. Because on this island, there is a great big forest. Trees of all different types. Beech and oak and elder and alder and holly and hazel. And it was in one of these big oak trees where this story begins. You see, at the top of one of these oak trees, out on a branch, there was a small nest. And in this nest lived a tiny little bird. And this brown bird had beautiful golden wings. And on this beautiful bright morning, it woke up and it jumped out of the nest and it hopped along to the edge of the tallest branch, and it listened to the dawn chorus, all of its parents and its brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles all singing out. And it ruffled its feathers up and it took a deep breath and it let out the most almighty nothing came out. It tried again. And the bird looked to its side and its mother had joined it. And the bird said, "Mum, why is it that all the other birds have a song, but I don't? And the mother said, well, little bird, we all have to find our own song. And the bird said, well, how do I find my own song? And the mother said, well, I don't know, but out there somewhere is a special thing, a song that only you can sing. So the bird said, well, I am going to go and find my special song. And with that, it ran to the edge of the branch and it took off and it flew up into the air. And it flew right above the great forest. And it wasn't long before it had left the island behind it. And it flew over the sea until it came to another landmass. And there it began to fly up the coast, looking down below for this special thing. And it looked and looked, but it couldn't find it. And then down below, it spotted a bird. This bird was quite tall, with grey feathers and long, spindly legs. It had a long, yellow beak. And the little bird flew down, and it looked up, and it was the heron. And the bird said, hello, Mr. Heron. I'm on an adventure. I'm looking for a special thing, a song that only I can sing. Do you know what it is? And the heron looked at the little bird and said, tell me where you have come from. The bird said, I came from the island over there. The heron said, well, I suggest you go. A little bird like you has no chance of finding your special song. Be gone, be gone. And the bird's heart was hurt. He said, I am. And if you don't know where it is, do you know who might? And the heron slowly shook its long neck. He said, if you insist, keep flying east, and there is another great forest. The wise owl lives there. Maybe the wise owl will know what your special song is. So the bird thanked the heron, and it took to the sky, and it flew again. Over the hills, over the land, into the valleys, until it came to this great, great forest. And there in the great forest it flew around, and it wasn't long before up in one of the trees it spotted the owl. And it swooped up, and it said, are you the wise owl? I'm a little bird. I'm looking for my special song. And the owl looked at the bird square in the eyes, and it said, who are you? Who are you? The bird said, I know who I am, but I'm looking for my special thing, the song that only I can sing. Do you know what it is? The owl looked at it again. He said, who are you? The bird said, are you sure you're the wise old owl? And he thanked the owl, and it turned and it flew off. And the bird continued to look. But days went by and weeks went by, and spring turned to summer and summer turned to autumn, and every bird it met, the blue tit, the great tit, the goldcrest, the wren, the robin, the woodpecker, none of them knew where the bird could find this song. And the bird continued on until the winter. And one cold winter's morning, when the whole of the ground was covered with snow, the bird took to the sky. It was exhausted by this time, but it hadn't given up. And it flew across the fields, and down below on the white ground, it saw a great big black bird, a raven. And it swooped down and it landed, and the raven looked very, very, very hungry. And it looked up, it said, hello, hungry raven. Please don't eat me. I'm looking for a special thing, a song that only I can sing. Do you know where it is? The raven looked at the bird and said, I do know where it is. Fly east as far as you possibly can, and there you will find an island. Your special song is amongst the trees. The bird said, oh, thank you so much. Thank you, raven. And it took to the sky and it flew off. But on the way to the island, it had a great ocean to cross. By now, the winter storms had come. The waves were lashing it with salt water. The wind was swirling, but the little bird carried on. It flew and it flew. And there in the distance, it saw this island. And this island was surrounded by blue sea. And the blue sea lapped up onto golden sand. And the golden sand ended at shrubs. And at the end of the shrubs were great trees of all types. Beech and birch, holly and hazel, oak and ash, elder and alder. The little bird thought, I recognise this place. This is my home. And the little bird flew back up and it was so disappointed with itself. It had gone on all that journey looking for its song, but it hadn't found it. It jumped in the nest, and when it got there, none of its parents or brothers or sisters were there, and it felt terribly alone. It hopped up to the branch where it had begun, and it ruffled its feathers, and it tilted its head back, and it called out for them. It thought it hadn't got its song, but there it was. And as it called out, its brothers and sisters and mum and dad came and landed. They said, you found your special thing, the song that only you can sing. And the little bird said, yes, I did. And together they all sat and they sang. They all lived happily ever after. That is the little songbird. A little story about finding your own song, finding your own story. So I'll leave that one with you. But any of these stories, please feel free to retell them as well if you feel moved by them. I'll leave that with you as we start, and I'm going to whip through a little bit of a few things here before we get to some more stories. But one thing I wanted to talk to you all about was why do we tell stories? Stories have been with us ever since the dawn of time. Since our hunter-gatherer times, we've been telling stories. We tell stories for many, many, many different reasons. Sometimes we tell stories as a way of passing on wisdom and passing on knowledge. Sometimes we tell them purely for entertainment. Sometimes we tell them for cultural immersion. We learn about other cultures and other cultures teach us about their ways of life. And in doing that, we learn that we're not all so different after all. Actually, stories can bring us together. We also still tell stories as a way of forming deeper connections with ourselves, a little bit like the story that we just had then, connections with each other through our own culture, and connections with nature as well. I'm going to talk a bit more about our hunter-gatherer past in a moment, but we mustn't forget that oral storytelling, from what we understand, was the main way of passing on wisdom and understanding back in our times as hunter-gatherers. We also know that story is very, very, very important when it comes to understanding our own culture and enhancing our own culture as well and carrying our own culture on. But story, it can be good for so many things, but it's also very, very, very powerful. We know through some of the studies and the science around what happens in the brain with stories, that stories can change the way that people think, it can change the way that people feel, and it can change the way that people see the world. So stories over time have also been used as a tool for persuasion, or you could even call it manipulation as well, which we will look at in a little bit. So as a storyteller, we have the world at our fingers. We really do have the power to help people see get deeper meaning in themselves, in each other, and in nature. but we have to treat that with the utmost respect, because we also have the potential to be able to change how people think and how people feel as well. So I spoke there a little bit about culture and how stories shape culture. Just going to talk a little bit about cultural changes in history and how story has changed in those times. And we'll start way, 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 way back at the times of our hunter-gatherers. From what we know, we don't know everything, we rely on a lot of stories in order to tell us this, is that during the times of the hunter-gatherers, stories were mainly focused around nature and our connection with nature, and we were seen as an equal part of nature. And a lot of stories were about reverence for nature, understanding of nature, and understanding our place in the whole web of life. The hunter-gatherer history, when we think about human history, makes up over 90% of our history as humans. So if you think about stories and that story being our main narrative, it has been our main narrative for the majority of our lives as human beings. Following our hunter-gathering times, we moved into the time of the agricultural revolution, and the narrative around culture during that time changed massively. The wilds and the nature which we were seen as being a part of, they became something that we had to be fearful of and something that should be tamed and then used. And a lot of the stories that were born in the agricultural revolution still sit with us to these days. When you think about some of the fairy stories that we still have, like Little Red Riding Hood and the wolf, or any kind of fairy story that has a wolf in it, it's always aimed at making the wolf a villain and killing the wolf. Three Little Pigs is similar as well. And even on some of those stories where they don't have a direct attack on a wolf, some of the stories have a direct attack on the woodland. Like you think about Snow White, for example, or Beauty and the Beast, for example, where you've got the deep, dark, horrible woodland that should be feared. And it's this huge change in the narrative from being a part of nature and feeling a deep sense of love for nature to being afraid of nature and fearing nature and taming nature. As we go further down, we go into colonialism time, and the stories, the cultural stories around that time were about adventures and quests, and often the heroes of the stories were the adventurers and the people who were conquerors. As we move closer to our modern day, we have the scientific and the technological revolution, and we think about stories of power and stories of control. And there's been a huge, some of you might have come across Robert Macfarlane's work and Jackie Morris's work around the lost words, but they talk a lot about this huge reduction in nature words being totally replaced by scientific and technological words. Even things as simple as like an apple. You say apple, you would think of a fruit, but the Apple, the company with computers, have tried to take that term. We think about web and spider's web. We think about a stream, or to stream digital content. And the more we look into it, so many of our nature words from our stories have been hijacked by scientific and technological companies. And along with this scientific and technological revolution, we also have the main story of our time, which is a story of capitalism and consumerism. And we think about story as being something which solidifies culture and encourages the culture to grow. The stories that we are surrounded by now all the time are these stories of us not being enough, needing more, buy more, you'll be satisfied. Some people say to me, oh, stories are dying out. Stories are a thing of the past. But stories absolutely aren't a thing of the past. There is as much story now as there has ever been before. It's just the stories that we are told in very, very different ways. Sometimes through digital marketing, sometimes through billboards, sometimes through TVs, sometimes through radio. But the main cultural story that we are given is this story of consumerism, because that's our main cultural narrative at the moment. So just to look at stories and childhood, everyone's still there? Give us a wave. We're all still there. Okay. So I want to tie this in a little bit now with Forest School. You might be thinking, where is he going? What's he talking about? But I want to tie this into Forest School a little bit. So when we think about story, we have an evolutionary right for story. We are the only animal that can tell a story, that can look into the past, dream into the future, and come up with something with our imagination that is totally fictitious or can bring these two things together. There is no other creature on the whole of the planet that can do this. So storytelling, just like we are made up of air and fire and water and earth, we are also made of story. We are story. We are the storytelling animal. I often say to people, try and tell me something about you without doing any storytelling. And it's near impossible. If you ask and you dig a little bit about why, there is always a story in there. We can't say anything without really telling a story. It's just how we communicate. And when we think about this in regards to Forest School, some of you may be aware of the work by Peter Gray. Peter Gray, he wrote a great book called Free to Learn, and he is an evolutionary psychologist, and he looks at the how play is an evolutionary and biological right for children, and how all children, just like all mammals, need to play in order to be able to learn and grow. And story is very, very, very similar to this. So if we look at this timeline that we've got here, I've tried to look at the cultural narrative and then the way that childhood was and how story impacted that. So you think back to our hunter-gatherer times, and the stories affirmed our connection with nature. Childhood was about play and freedom and exploration. It was about trust and connection. And really, the education that we know from that time was really the true sense of the word education, which is this idea of drawing out rather than filling in. Children were seen as being trusted to make sense of the world themselves without having like a rote education, like what our main education system is now. So it was very different. And the stories that set that culture were very, very much in line with it. When we had the agricultural revolution, we have this idea of taming nature and fearing nature. And the narrative, the childhood then was about working on the land, using the land and animal husbandry. In the Industrial Revolution, we had the kings and the queens and the lords and the ladies in our stories, this kind of hierarchy of society. And children and childhood was about dangerous employment in terrible conditions in awful, awful factories. And then as we move to more of our current time, we've got the scientific revolution, stories about empowerment and control. And this idea of childhood has been this formal rote education, which is very, very much focused on scientific methods of understanding and controlling everything. And then the last one, I think there's another one there, I can't see it. Yeah, the capital and consumerism stories is this idea of you are not enough, and they are stories of need. And children in many, many ways, and it's so sad to see, have become a target for consumers as well. So the childhood story has changed along with the stories of our time too. And I think that's why when we consider storytelling and we think about Forest School, we're actually in a very, very, very privileged place as Forest School leaders. Because when we look at the principles of Forest School and we look at the culture that we're trying to develop in our Forest School settings, it is that of the hunter-gatherers, this play-based approach to learning where children feel a part of nature. So in that time, they also had access to these nature-based stories. And the fact that we have an environment where we can provide children with these things, I think from my own experience, is one of the reasons why children absolutely love Forest School and they want to come back and they want to come back. It's because we give them access to something which is as pure as it was for 90% of our human history. So if we're gonna tell stories at Forest School, what are the stories that we tell? I often think, and some of you may have come up against this, that Forest School is always in a bit of a challenging situation because culturally it butts up against a number of things in our society. And I feel that the culture that we create at Forest School is different. So when children come into Forest School, how do we introduce them into that culture? How do we help them understand that some of the things that we do here are different to what they might do elsewhere? And I think that storytelling has a big part to play in regards to that. You can see on my slide here, I've got 3 different stories. And on my left there, I've got the We're Going on a Bear Hunt story. I'm not going to ask you to put your hand up if you've ever read it, but many, many years ago, I was working with a nursery and they said, Danny, we've got this great book. Can you read it for us at Forest School? I'd never come across it before. And I said, yeah, what is it? Bring it out and I'll have a look at it. And they brought it out and I opened it. And I was totally shocked by the narrative in the We're Going on a Bear Hunt story. When you think about where the stories that we tell and the historical timeline of where stories come from, the story of We're Going on a Bear Hunt has got the narrative of that agricultural revolution. This idea that we're going to go out, we're going to hunt a bear, and we're going to catch ourselves a big one. And then every time they come across something in nature, it's like, oh, there's grass. Oh no, grass. And then it's, oh, it's mud. Oh no, mud. This kind of fear about nature and this like nature is something we should be afraid of or we should be upset about. So I read it and I said, I'm really sorry. As much as it looks like a lovely book, there's a deeper meaning in there, which for me goes directly against what I think Forest School is. I think Forest School is about developing a love for nature, that Forest School is about having communion with the animals that we see in nature and the insects, not hunting them and then being afraid of everything that we come across. So for me, outdoor education has always been about trying to create experiences where children can develop a deep love with nature, fall in love with nature, and then protect nature as they get older. If we're going to use story as that, we've just got to make sure that we use the right kind of stories in our Forest School. So I'm going to tell you a story. Which means I could take a breath because that was a lot of theory stuff for me. And I'd love to tell you a story. Do you want to hear another story? Okay, good. One little rule that we have for storytelling is that you should never force somebody to hear a story, and you should never force somebody to tell a story either. It should always be by choice, which I think is lovely because that fits in with Forest School as well. And if we had more time, I'd tell you about. We haven't got more time. I'm going to tell you this. I'm going to tell you this story. So this story, when we think about introducing new cultural norms into our Forest School, this story helped me lots and lots and lots. When I first started doing Forest School, I was really not upset. I wasn't upset, but I was surprised to see children whacking trees with sticks. Sure, you've all seen it. And as a new Forest School leader, I was kind of torn because I was thinking, well, I'm not supposed to go over there and tell them, don't do that. I should use inquiry. And I'd go over and I'd use inquiry and I'd be like, oh, do you think that tree wants to be hit by a stick? And immediately the kids are looking at you as if to say, it's just a tree. But in my heart, it's more than a tree. It deserves to be there. It's been there a long time. It's alive. It has a right. to be there. It has spirit. But how do you communicate all of that to a child in the moment who just wants to play and hit the tree with sticks? So I thought, you know what? I'm going to try and use story to do this. So I wrote this story called The Tree People, and I've been telling it at Forest School, not only in the, maybe if I get a new group, it's one of maybe the first or the second session, because it helps us trying to get a different understanding about the trees as soon as we arrive. So this story, like many stories, is very, very, very old. So old that when this story happened, there wasn't a single tree on the whole of the earth. Not one, not even a little shrub. The whole world was covered with fields. There also weren't any houses, any cars, any planes, any trains, any bikes, any schools. Can you imagine a time with no schools? But there was one place where people lived. It was on the side of a very, very steep hill. It was a scattering of mud huts. It was called Jabber Jerome. And in Jabber Jerome, most of the people who lived there were very, very, very happy, especially the children. The children got to run and play all day. They were free. They could climb the hill and roll back down it. They would climb up boulders and dam streams and run through the wildflowers. It was a great time to be a child. But there were some people in Jabber Jerome who weren't very happy. And those people were the very, very, very elderly men and the very, very elderly women. And they weren't happy because, some of you might know this, I've been getting it recently, but their shoulders were aching and their neck was crick and their knees were sore and their back was sore. And they'd watch the children run and climb and jump, and how they wished that they could be strong again. They'd watch the children as they'd run around and they'd just say, oh, I wish that I could have my strength and beauty back. One day, one of the very, very, very elderly men was sat outside of his mud hut and he began to cry. And then he began to wail, oh, 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 oh. And he called out, I want to be strong and beautiful forever and ever. His words left his mouth and they took to the sky and they swirled around till the wind picked them up and blew them down the hill into the valley. And in the valley, the words swirled until they found a river. And they swirled up the river for many, many miles until they arrived at another man. Now, this man had a long white beard. He had a hat on, was cream, and went over to one side with a big bobble on the end. He carried with him a great big stick. How did he have a stick if there were no trees? I asked. I don't know, but around his neck he had a piece of string with a silver acorn. And on one hand he had the letters O-D, and on the other hand it said I-N. And he heard this. I want to be strong and beautiful forever. And he thought to himself, I know a magical spell for that. And he gathered all things up into his little pouch. He threw it over his shoulder and he began to walk. And he walked for days and days down the river, through the valley, until he arrived at the great hillside of Jabber Jerome. And when he got there, he climbed up the hill. And he gathered all of the elderly people together. He said, is it true that you want eternal strength and beauty? And they said, yes, it is true, it is true. He said, then follow me down into the valley, for I have just that. So they all followed him. And they got down into the valley on the edge of a great field. And there he reached into his cloak and he pulled out a ball of white. And he pointed the ball of light at the ground and it began to shake. And as he lifted it up, it created a huge wooden archway. And he said to the elderly people, whoever passes through here will have eternal strength and beauty. And they all looked at each other. Could he be trusted? Then all of a sudden, all at once, they all dived towards the archway and they all arrived at the same time and they got stuck. And there was pushing and shoving and all trying to get through. And then all at once, they all popped through. And they rolled and they scattered. And the man with the white beard stepped back and he folded his arms. And he watched. He watched as every single one of them began to stand up. First onto their hands, then onto their knees. And as they lifted their arms high, every single one of them turned into trees. There was the beech and the oak and the ash and the sycamore and the elder and the alder and the holly, and a little blackbird flew in and landed and sang a beautiful song of gratitude. And the man with the beard said, there you go. Every year in the springtime, you will get new beautiful buds. Every spring, your beauty will be renewed. And as you grow taller and taller, you will get stronger and stronger. For this is what eternal strength and beauty looks like. And he turned and he headed off. And as he passed Jabba Jerome, he called in and he said to the children, come on round. He said, head down into the valley. And when you get down there, you will find something you have never seen before. The children ran as fast as they could. And as they got there, their eyes opened wide, their mouths were aghast. It was the first ever forest. And they ran in amongst the trees, and they played amongst the trees, and on calm days they listened, because they could hear the voices in the trees. They came every day and every week and every month. But as the years went by, the children forgot about the people in the trees and the children stopped coming to the forest. So the trees said, if the children won't come to us, we will go to them. And they called on the wind and they said, wind, blow our seeds far and wide. And the wind took the seeds and the seeds spread all over the world. And as the seeds spread all over the world, new trees began to grow, just like the ones outside your window. And every single tree in your forest school or in your garden is an ancestor of those very first trees that were created by the wizard Whitebeard. And that's the story of the tree people. And kids completely stopped hitting trees with sticks then. It was like magic. It wasn't really. We continue on that quest of tree bashing, I guess. But I hope you enjoyed that story, the story of the tree people. If we had more time and we were in a bit more like sat around a campfire, we'd pick the bones out of that story. But really, for me, I wrote that story and I tell that story just as a way to help people look at the trees in a slightly different way. Some children will go off and I'll say to them, do you want to go off and see if you can find an eye in the tree or maybe an arm or a face, and they'll go off and they'll try and make sense of the trees around them. So I'm going to keep going because I know that we are getting close on time. And I've got two more stories that I want to tell you. And how are we for time, Matt? We're okay? Okay. So that was story to help identify our culture at Forest School. How can we use story in that way? The next way that we can use story at Forest School is story to share wisdom, or story as a facilitator. So many old folk tales were told as ways to share wisdom with people. And we know at Forest School, we're not there as Forest School leaders to impart knowledge into people. We also want to be drawing knowledge out. So sometimes a well-placed story in your Forest School session can lay the seeds for children to help draw that knowledge out of them as well. This story that I'm going to tell you is called The Legend of the Dandelion. And I'm sure you've all seen a dandelion today. At least a handful of them, they're everywhere. But this story can be used, and there's so many botanical folk tales like this that work really, really well at Forest School. So I'll tell you the story. The story is called The Legend of the Dandelion, and the story is a story about fairies. Put up your hand if you've ever seen a fairy. Come on, you all work in the woods. Surely that's everybody's hand up there. Janine, you raised your hand. I got a little notification. So one day, all the fairies had got together for their annual general meeting. And they were all sat around and they were talking about everything fairy. And the great fairy of the animals, she looked at the other fairies. She said, "Oh, it's been a lovely time in the animal kingdom." She said, "This year, my favourite animal is the unicorn." And they said, "Oh, really?" She said, "Yeah." And then another fairy said, the fairy from the ocean kingdom said, "Well, this year my favourite has been the selkie, because the selkie's so wonderful. It's part mystery and part human, just like I am." And then the tree fairy said, "Well, my favourite this year has been the silver birch tree. Oh, how beautiful she looked in the spring with her white bark." And then they all looked at the flower fairy. They said, who's your favourite flower fairy?" And the flower fairy said, "Well, I've never thought about a favourite flower." They said, "Oh, you've got to have a favourite." She said, "I think you're right." And she jumped out of the window and flitted off in search of her favourite flower. And she flew around, and she flew through some castle gates and down onto this beautiful, pristine lawn. And in the middle of the pristine lawn was a tall tulip with pink petals. And the fairy flew over and said, "Hi, Tulip, I am trying to figure out who is my favourite flower. Do you mind if I ask you a question?" And the tulip said, "No, not at all." And she said, "Well, if you could grow anywhere at all, where would that be?" And the tulip said, "Well, that's easy. There is no greater place to grow than here on this velveteen lawn. This is the perfect place. You see, every morning the beautiful princess comes out and she strokes my petals and she tells me how beautiful I am. If I was going to grow anywhere, I would grow here." And the flower fairy looked at the tulip and said, "Well, thank you very much. You're not the flower for me." And she flew on. And she flew on. She didn't have to go far when she came to the castle walls. And there, growing up the castle wall, was a beautiful yellow rose. And the fairy flew over and said, "Rose, do you mind if I ask you a question?" And the rose said, "No, not at all." She said, "If you could grow anywhere at all, where would it be?" And the rose said, "Well, that is easy. You see, this wall here faces south. I get as much sun as I need here, and it won't be long before I get a little higher and I go straight in front of the king's bedroom. I am sure that every day will come out and tell me how wonderful I am." And the flower fairy said, "Oh, thank you, Rose. It's lovely to know, but you're not the flower for me." And the fairy flew on. And the fairy flew out of the castle gates and down into the woodland. And there in the woodland, she came across the violet. She said, "Good afternoon, Violet. Do you mind if I ask you a question?" Violet said, "Of course." She said, "If there was anywhere that you could grow, anywhere at all, where would it be?" And the violet said, "Well, this is the place. The tall trees just give me all the shade I need, and the babbling brook just keeps my roots the perfect amount of water. Oh, This is the perfect place for me. The fairy thought about that for a moment. Says, better, but you're not the flower for me. And she flew off. And she visited many, 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 many flowers until she came to an old patch of scrubland. And there on the old patch of scrubland was the humble dandelion. And the fairy said, Dandelion, do you mind if I ask you a question? And the dandelion said, of course not. She said, if you could grow anywhere at all, where would it be? And the dandelion, without hesitation, said, well, that is easy. If I could grow anywhere at all, I would always grow where the children are. I'll grow in parks, on playing fields, in hedgerows. I'll even grow in those little cracks in the concrete. So on those days when they can't get out into nature, they'll still see me. And the flower fairy said, but why? And the dandelion said, well, because I am the first flower that comes up after the long, cold winters. And I can bring joy to those children and welcome them back outside for the spring. And the flower fairy smiled and she nodded her head and she said, Dandelion, that is the kindest and most generous thing I have heard all day. She said, Dandelion, you are the flower for me. And because of your kindness and your generosity, I'm going to make it so that you don't get to flower just once a year. You can flower twice. Once at the start of the spring for the children, and then again in the summer, just for you. And it has always been that way ever since. And also ever since, the dandelion has always been known as the children's flower. That is the legend of the dandelion. So a story to share wisdom. The dandelion, the humble dandelion, often kicked aside and seen as a weed. Just imagine if every child had been told a bedtime story where the dandelion was the children's flower. Maybe people would see them in a different light. But some lovely little wisdom in there about the dandelion being one of the early flowers to come up, and also that where the dandelion will flower twice as well. So a little story there that gives us some more information about one of our native plants, which is often misunderstood as a weed. I don't think we've got time for this story, but I can talk a little bit about it. Is that all right? I know it's coming up to 9 o'clock. So what I would say to you all is if you scan this QR code on here, you'll be able to listen to this story. The recording is of me a few years ago. Got nice long locks. But check the story out. But I'll just tell you a little bit about this story and why I use it and why I wrote it. So I once, many years ago, this about 13, 14 years ago, I went to observe an outdoor education session, and there was a classroom, there was a class of children and their teacher, and there was a ranger, and they'd taken them out into the woods, and the ranger had gotten them all together and said, right, today we're going to do tree ID. And what I'd like you to do is match the bark on the trees with the bark on these worksheets and just tick them off. And then when everyone's done, come on in, first one gets a prize. So they handed out the sheets and they said, off you go, go and do it. And the children ran off, and some children started to climb trees. Some children started to play tig. Some children started to drag sticks to make dens. And the teacher went absolutely bonkers at them. And she was really upset because she said they disrespected the ranger and they should have been doing the worksheets. And I just stood there and thought, these children are just following their evolutionary drive to play. And especially when you take them into the woodland and they're getting in trouble for it. And I just looked and thought, this isn't the way to do it. But I massively value as well this idea of seeking and searching in nature as well. But I said on that day I would never use a worksheet. in the woods again. So I had to come up with something else. So I went to my trusty stories, I guess, because story for me, yeah, it can offer so much. So I wrote this story, which is the magic ring story, and it's a story about a magical ring that is held by a lady who lives in a forest. And the ring comes under threat, and she asks the creatures to help her. It's a little bit Tolkien-esque. They won't help her, so she hides the ring in the woods. And the way that I use this story at Forest School is that the story doesn't have an ending, and I kind of get some buy-in from the kids about looking for the ring. So at the end of the story, I say to the kids, "Shall we go and look for the ring?" And all the kids go, "Yeah, let's go and look for the ring." And they go off, and I've got kids all over the place looking for this ring. And I also tell this little story of one time I was shopping in my local supermarket, and I turned to go down the aisle with my trolley, and two twins that I worked with for a number of years come charging up the aisle to me, and they said, "Danny, Danny." I said, "Yeah." They went, "It's not in Flamingo Land." And I said, "What isn't in Flamingo Land?" They said, "The ring. We looked everywhere for it." And I said, "Oh, keep searching for the ring." But the story has had it's just taken on a life of itself with so many children who have gone out and they've looked for the ring in their local park, in their gardens, on their holidays. The story has done so much more than any worksheet possibly could. And not because I told them to do something, it's because I just planted the seed of the story with them. The other thing that this story has done as well, it has encouraged lots and lots and lots of play at Forest School, where sometimes kids will come over to me, and there's a character in the story. He's a small man with a red cloak and a purple cloak. And the kids will come over and say, "Danny, he's hiding in the brambles." And I'll say, "Who's hiding in the brambles?" They'll say, "The man with the hood." And I'll say, "Oh, really?" And you go over and they've started engaged in lots and lots of fantasy play all around this story, which kind of brings me on to the next bit, which is story as a playmate. So some of you, or all of you, maybe know this about the nature play cycle and this whole idea of this dance that we do as Forest School leaders in between adult-led, adult-initiated, child-initiated, child-led, and our attempts to always make things as child-led as possible. However, we use many, many different ways to get there. One thing that I do lots and lots is use story as a play initiator. So I might tell a story and leave it open-ended. And for those children who don't have a particularly active play drive, or for those children who can't give play cues or don't pick up on play cues, sometimes story can be one possible thing that we use to try and get them into their play. So again, you've got to choose your stories really, really carefully. But story at Forest School could absolutely be a play initiator. 100%. I've seen it so many times. So that's us for stories. And I just want to talk a little bit about some tips and tricks for storytelling. First thing that we spoke about was understanding your personal story and the storyteller's heart. I don't really need to talk about that again. For a new storyteller, one of the big recommendations I would say is to choose stories that include the power of three. So the power of three, when we think about our brains and the way our brains work, three is the first number that our brains can make a sequence of. So if you think back to when we were in lockdown, don't think too much about it, but just go there for a second, and we were getting those 3-word phrases thrown at us like hands, face, space, and people like, "Why do you just keep saying 3 words at us?" And it was because the people who were coming up with those phrases, they knew the power of three. Very simple 3 words, which our brain can recognize and remember really, really easily. So as a new storyteller, if you're thinking, oh my God, how am I going to remember it? Try and break everything down into threes. So when I do that, I always think about the beginning, the middle, and the end as a three. And often if you're using nature-based stories, the beginning is all about when is the story and where is the story, and trying our best to paint the picture and bring people into the story so they actually feel a part of it. When I told the first story about the little songbird, and I did the whole thing about the little stream and the river and the rowboat, and all of that was just a way of bringing you in at the start. Then the middle of the story is often where the characters are introduced and the adventure or the quest. And then the end is where it's solved and you kind of tie it back into the middle. Back into the beginning of the story as well. So try and find something that you can do that with. Also, in the middle section, look for a story that has something called the trio of significance, which is things like the three billy goats gruff, where three things happen. The three bears, for example, in the story that I told you about, the dandelion, we had the tulip and the rose and the violet. So we've got this power of three right in the middle of the story as well. So they'd be the basic tips that I would give in regards to structuring the story. Performing with passion. So understanding your storyteller's voice and practicing it is really important. So I always say to people, before you tell a story to a group, say it out loud 3 times. So you might want to do that in the car. I do it when I go fell running. So I'm the crazy fell runner who's telling stories to the dry stone walls as I'm running along. But you'll be able to start practicing with certain things like volume and pace and tempo and pause. All key things that are tools of engagement when it comes to storytelling as well. Another thing you could do is use props, where I used this little bird at one point. That was just one prop. But sometimes if I've got a complicated story, I might have props and use them as anchors. So I might lay the props down in order of where they come in the story. So at any point I can look down and I can see, okay, I know that I've got to get there, and I've got to get there, and I've got to get there, and I've got to get there as well. So props can also be tools to help you remember the story as well. And the last thing that I would say is join the listener in the story. Being a storyteller, sometimes people think it's all about standing there and delivering a story. But being a storyteller, it's about a joined communion with the listener. And when you do it in nature, it's also with the birds and the trees and the wind. And it's quite a mindful thing to do, but don't separate yourself from all of that and just be somebody who delivers a story. Be somebody who gets in amongst the story with your listeners and with all of the elements around you as well. I always say that when you're telling a story in a group, it should never be the same twice. It should always be different, because you're interacting with different people on different days. So some people think, oh, what if I forget it? If you forget it, that's okay, because it should be different. It should be different anyway. So with that, I think that is me done. All I'd say is, if you do have the courage to tell stories, be light-hearted about it, have some fun with it. And if you can bring them into your forest school, I wish you the best of luck with it, because they can bring so much power and so much to the sessions as well. So thank you for giving me your ears.